RS3 tends to flutter when lift off throttle. Is this due to wastegate not big enough? On other VW Audi platforms, people tend to stay away from the flutter. Is it okay on the DAZA?
Okay, we should probably talk about sounds that cars make and what wastegates are and what sounds wastegates make.
Yeah, so wastegates don't really make a sound. There's a big misconception that the Audi IMSA GTO and the Trans Am, back there used to be one here.
Yep.
That they would go. Well, that's not the wastegate. So that's turbo surge, and that's the compressor surging against a closed throttle body. So those cars specifically made that sound because Audi believed, and their philosophy was that they wanted to keep the pressure between the turbo and the throttle. They didn't want to bleed it off using a bypass. And so that's why those cars would make that sound. It's very hard on the turbo. Yep. And so they had designing and engineering turbos that would basically last one race before they needed to be rebuilt. And the thrust bearings and friction surfaces inside the turbo would be tortured by what happens. So what happens is you open the throttle, air comes in through the turbo, combustion happens, it goes through the turbine, and everything spins up. And so the compressor starts making boost. And on the compressor wheel, between the compressor wheel and the intake valve, there's whatever boost. And I think those cars probably ran around 30 pounds of boost on track. So what happens is you have flowing pressure. We've talked about this before. There's not just pressure in your intake. There's pressure moving through your intake very rapidly. And that's why so much CFM is required from a turbocharger to make that much power. But the second you shut the throttle, that you now have flowing pressure that turns into static pressure. And the compressor wheel is spinning, and it's no longer being powered on the turbine side. So you have this 30 psi that hits the throttle, and it comes back through the compressor wheel, and the turbo actually spins backwards. But it's not a on or off thing, and so the turbo will go choo, 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 and as air bleeds back through the compressor wheel, it makes that fluttering sound. And so that's what you're hearing on your RS3 when you shut the throttle. The bypass valve isn't opening fast as it could or should, and so you're hearing that fluttering, which is compressor surge, which is this pressure wave going back through the compressor wheel, out the turbo inlet, and then getting sucked back in and out as the fluttering happens. It's hard on the turbo. It's not great. That's why you have a bypass valve. I don't know, Nate. Can you comment on why the factory programs it that way? Or
honestly, it depends. I don't know what intake is on the car, but frankly, what you're probably hearing is that bypass valve, and you're hearing that rush of air coming back through the bypass valve, which is then in the intake pipe, which is this far from your filter. So
I heard this on factory cars though, that
you
they do for
flutter,
like a half a second.
Yeah, and there is some delay before that valve opens. So you are going to hear some of that, and depending on the tune, you can get surge on a lot of these turbos, which is basically it's the exact same effect even if you're wide open throttle. If you're building too much boost for the turbo to sustain, you'll get a back surge of air, coming back across the turbo essentially, you'll get a fluttering sound as boost is ramping up at low RPM.
Right, and the reason for that is there's not enough exhaust pressure to truly drive the compressor wheel to produce that boost, and so it starts producing boost, but there's not enough energy behind the turbine wheel. And then once you get to a certain RPM, there's enough flow to support that. But it's the turbo just kind of getting going.
Yeah. So all turbos have a surge line, which is right. Basically that
you look at the
limitation.
If you look at the compressor map, there is a line on the left side. Yep. The second you drop below that, the compressor wheel cannot support the flow based on the turbine wheel energy at that flow on RPM. Yep. So.
But it's probably a combination of the sounds you're hearing on that when you lift. You're going to hear, the discharge from the bypass valve. The turbo may be stalling a little bit depending on how quickly it interacts. It's not necessarily, it's a little bit of that extra load I was talking about on the turbo, but usually it's a pretty quick situation.
It's not a problem. I wouldn't worry about it on these cars.
And you'll hear that factory, like you put an intake on these cars and a factory tune, you'll hear that. So they're doing it,
It's not necessarily a bad thing because Audi was right in those race cars. Is there's something to be said for keeping some of that pressure and not bleeding off immediately.
Right.
And if it's clear that you're not going to use it, then bleed it off. But if you're shifting, there's no reason to open that valve. And a split second,
you've got to recharge the entire intake.
It's worth it. But you notice this with these big like tile 50 mil blow off valves. You go raw, it's all, and all the air comes out, and then the turbo's just like, and has to like fill the whole intake back up. So, generally in race cars that we've built and designed, I've put smaller bypass, and not bled off as much.
Right. You can tune them as well. Usually, so you have a kind of a residual amount of pressure left in the intake.
And that's what you can do with the tiles is you can put stiffer springs in, so it only bleeds off so much of it, and it does keep some.
And you can do that with the factory calibration as well, because those are all targeted. It's electronically controlled bypass valve.
And that's another good argument for having short, efficient intake tracks without lots of big, voluminous tubing. That's fine on the dyno. It can be okay drag racing, but it does take time to fill all of that up.
Yep.
To achieve the certain.
We've talked about that a lot too. Is turbo sizing? It can look great on a dyno or a drag strip, and then when you actually try and drive it on the street or on a road course, you can be a lot slower at times because you've got a lot of inertia and a lot more.
But it might look great on the dyno sheet, and everyone's like, "Look, it spools up faster than stock."
Yeah, but that's from like a 2,000 RPM. They're sitting on it, and it's taking. You're not seeing the time it takes to spool.
In fourth gear, which is really loaded up.